Journey to God's House, chapter 24, entitled Mr. Coffee, You're No Joe DiMaggio. So the author talks about how many people, regular people, non-Jehovah's Witnesses, have heroes. And for some people, for many people, their heroes are sports stars or athletes. And so he talks about a particular brand of coffee called Mr. Coffee and how they chose Joe DiMaggio over Pete Rose. Now, Joe DiMaggio was a sports hero to a different generation than the authors, and Pete Rose was the current sports hero at the time. But instead, they chose Joe DiMaggio. So that's going to play a little factor in this chapter. He says that at Bethel they had their own Mr. Coffee. He often yelled at the Bethelites for drinking coffee, and it turns out he was a New York native who had been disfellowshipped for smoking, but he never made the effort to get reinstated. How does one get reinstated? Well, depending on the crime is how much time is to be paid. And also depending on how often you have been punished for that crime is how much time you have to pay. So first offense, I don't know, 6 to 9 months. You gotta go to all the meetings. You gotta sit way in the back of the Kingdom Hall. You gotta show up seconds before the song starts, and you have to leave immediately after the amen is said at the end of the meeting. Oh yeah, by the way, don't look at anyone because they're not going to make eye contact with you. And don't even try and shake their hands. So do this, humiliate yourself for 6 to 9 months, you can get reinstated. For me, I will tell you, the second time I was disfellowshipped, it took me just over 2 years to get reinstated. That's how much the brothers didn't like me. But anyways, I digress. Mr. Coffee didn't bother to humiliate himself. He said, forget it, I'm not getting reinstated. Well, he did have an issue with the organization, and that's why he probably didn't try and get reinstated. His issue was that of drinking coffee, and that it was particularly hypocritical that other drugs were okayed by the Watchtower Society, like, for example, alcohol or over-the-counter drugs. But this particular vice was deemed sinful and worthy of disfellowshipping. And now, although other religions, such as Mormons, they also do not allow tobacco, but they don't allow caffeine or alcohol. And the author mentions that it's kind of odd that the Mormons and even these other religions, how the Jehovah's Witnesses were not holier than them regarding these issues because they viewed themselves as the most pious, the most holy, the true religion. So anyways, Mr. Coffee would be in front of various buildings, standing and yelling for hours. And he mentions that he'd be yelling at the top of his lungs about caffeine. And he would say things like, hey, Watchtower slave, have your fix this morning, did you? Or, hey, you Bethel grunt, get your coffee fixed today? And I guess if he was in a particularly bad mood or better mood, whichever way you want to look at it, he would get a little bit more touchy, especially with some of the sisters, and would say things like, hey, you Bethel whore, yeah, you, dressed like a harlot today, are we? Hey, tainted hussy, walking the streets today, are you? And so he had his own form of preaching, just like the witnesses had their form. But he was an apostate, and the author mentions he could have been a pioneer apostate with all the hours he was getting in. So it was too bad that his vice had to be smoking, because had it been drinking beer, slurping down cases of soda, gulping down pots of coffee, or anything else, that would have been all right. You can be an elder and be a drunkard. True story. But no, his vice was smoking, and so therefore he got the boot. So by them calling him Mr. Coffee, they were kind of making a funny reference to the Joe DiMaggio commercials of the time and calling this guy Mr. Coffee. And so he says the funniest story about Mr. Coffee was that he got ran over by a Bethelite in a truck that the society had owned. Oh my, that was probably the worst thing that could happen. But he wasn't seriously hurt. And of course, that probably made him despise the society just a little bit more. I don't know. That's my guess. So the author says, by the way, like we did everything else, we eventually nicknamed the truck that ran over Mr. Coffee. They called it the Coffee Creamer. Good night, folks. Thank you for taking time to listen to my summary of the book, Journey to God's House. Post your comments, like and share this video, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next chapter.